Good evening and welcome to the 2022 State Superintendent of Education debate, live from South Carolina ETV Studios in Columbia. I'm Gavin Jackson. Joining me tonight to question the candidates is Shauna Adcox of the Post and Courier. With Election Day less than 1 week away, we are joined in studio with the two candidates who are running for State Superintendent of Education. And they are Democrat Lisa Ellis and Republican Ellen Weaver. They were the only candidates who met our debate criteria, which can be found online at scetv.org/elections. Before we begin tonight, some ground rules. Each candidate will have the opportunity to make a 1-minute opening statement, and from there they will have 90 seconds to answer the questions. If necessary, I will allow for a 1-minute rebuttal. Candidates drew numbers when they arrived for starting order, and Lisa Ellis, we begin with your opening statement.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Ellis. I am in my 22nd year of working in schools. I've worked in 4 schools, 3 school districts, middle school and high school, all levels of English. I'm currently the Director of Student Activities at Blythewood High School, and that job consists of being responsible for everything that is not academic and non-athletic. It's a job that I love. 4 years ago, I started a closed Facebook group for teachers called SC for Ed, which turned into a grassroots advocacy movement to place a high-quality teacher in every classroom. And I'm so proud of the work that we've done to advocate on behalf of teachers and encourage them to fight for their profession and the well-being of their students. My education consists of 2 master's degrees, one from Clemson University and one from Columbia College. Lastly, my goal for education is to place a high-quality teacher in the classroom and provide a high-quality education for all of our students.
Thank you, Ms. Ellis. Ms. Weaver.
Good evening. My name is Ellen Weaver, and it's a joy to be with you tonight to share my vision and passion for serving the students, parents, and teachers of this state as your next Superintendent of Education. This is a huge job that requires leadership, management, and policy experience, all things that I've been privileged to hone over the last 2 decades of my career. But this is more than just a job to me. As the proud graduate of an amazing public school, I know firsthand that an education is the front door of the American dream. And my dream for every student in South Carolina, whether that's my little friend Lila, who has Down syndrome, or her big brother Garrett, who is a gifted and talented student, is for them to have the opportunity of a great education that empowers them to reach their full God-given potential wherever and however they learn best. Unfortunately, my opponent has chosen to spend her campaign using fear and distortion to distract from her far-left, union-driven agenda. Tonight, I look forward to the opportunity to set the record straight and humbly ask for your support on November 8th.
Thank you, Ms. Weaver. And we have the first question to you, similar to what we just heard in your opening statements, but tell us more about your backgrounds and your qualifications. Tell us why you are the most qualified candidate to run South Carolina schools.
Well, this job is all about executive leadership. While I greatly value the expertise and calling of our teachers in the classroom, this is a management role of a multi-billion-dollar state agency with over 1,000 employees. And so that leadership experience that I have had in managing large budgets and staffs, founding a nonprofit, and serving in education policy on the Education Oversight Committee has given me a front row seat to understand the challenges that our education system faces, as well as the opportunities that are before us as a state. I truly believe that being totally transparent and rebuilding trust, we can work together to make South Carolina the greatest education system in the country, where again, every student has the opportunity to reach their full God-given potential.
Ms. Ellis, tell us more about your qualifications and your background to lead South Carolina schools.
I'm a teacher. Teachers are natural problem solvers. When I think about the decisions that I have to make daily in the classroom for my students, it is ones where we deal with effective communication, critical thinking, and all of those important characteristics that come with it. My experience as Director of Student Activities has been handling budgets. What I have seen through my 22-year experience in the classroom is the fact that what's happening at the policy level is not helping students and teachers down in the trenches or in the classrooms. And so I believe that the teacher voice, understanding what is really going on in schools and how best to fix that, needs to come up to the policy level. With that, with bringing all of our stakeholders to the table, including our teachers, our superintendents, our parents, our students. That's how we can really solve our problems in public education. But we have to be willing to listen to what actually the problems are and not what some people think that the problems are.
Ms. Ellis, this next question is for you. This school year, the state budget sets minimum pay for a first-year teacher at $40,000. That's $10,000 higher than 6 years ago. How much higher should it be to attract and retain more teachers? And how will you persuade legislators to fund your proposal?
I think that it's important to understand that while setting the minimum teacher salary schedule up to $40,000 and adjusting it does not mean that teachers saw a $4,000 salary increase this year. For example, I saw $1,700, which equates to $11 a paycheck. Just to give you an idea of what that looks like, our school cafeteria, my lunch salad costs $6. So I think it's important for us to understand that when we talk about increasing the salaries, that not all teachers have seen that over the policy. I think that we have to really look at compensating our teachers and comparing the compensation for their professional degrees against all industries. We're no longer competing against other education. We're competing against all jobs that exist out there. And so if you want to make it competitive, you have to look outside of education and look at it that way. For example, a teacher who majors in chemistry can go and be a chemistry teacher, or they can go and work for a pharmaceutical company and make twice as much. So you've got to look at attracting your best and brightest by paying for it. Over the last 4 years, we've had enough budget surplus to be able to solve that problem, and yet the General Assembly has chosen not to. So I think that we have to encourage, if we want to retain and recruit teachers that are great and really there for our students, we have to stop looking at the way that we've always done it and look at how we move forward.
Right. Ms. Weaver, to you about teacher pay.
Gavin, that's a great question, and I think you hit on a really critical point, which is we can talk about the problems, and my opponent has rightly identified many of the challenges that our classroom teachers face as a classroom teacher, but talking about the problems is not the same thing as solving them. You have to actually be able to work with the General Assembly, with the governor, with superintendents and parents and educators around the state in order to actually get anything done. I have spent the last 10 years of my life building trusted relationships with the leaders in the General Assembly, who are the ones who run this state and who hold the purse strings and who are going to be the final deciders of whatever we do in education policy, including teacher salaries. As superintendent, I would like to see us get our teacher salaries raised up not just to the southeastern average, which is where we currently are, but to the national average over the next 5 years. And one of the ways that I'm going to do that is to find savings in our current education budget. People ask me all the time, Ellen, is education in South Carolina underfunded? And I have to say, no, it's misfunded. In the conversations that I've had with teachers across this state, they tell me about books that are sitting in closets that have been unopened, technology that's not being used. We know that there is so much waste and inefficiency within the system, and as the state superintendent of education, I'll start by getting my own house in order at the State Department of Education, top to bottom audit to understand how money is currently being spent, where we can find savings so that we can return that money to the classroom to support our students and our teachers.
Thank you, Ms. Weaver. Shauna has the next question to you.
So on the same sort of topic in terms of the teacher shortage crisis, pay alone is not going to solve the problem. What else do we need to be doing to retain and keep high quality teachers, and what can the superintendent do without legislative action?
Well, one of the most important things that I think we need to do in conversations that I've heard with teachers across this state is a top to bottom audit of Title 59 to cut the dead wood that we know that's in there. There are old programs that were passed 30, 40, 50 years ago that maybe were a good idea at the time, but are just no longer relevant to our educational system of the 21st century. And so cutting that red tape for teachers to allow them to actually do what they love to do and what they're best at, which is teaching students, is critically important. Another thing that I've heard in speaking with teachers around this state is that discipline is a critical issue. We have administrators who are afraid to have their teachers back when they send students down to the office for discipline, and we have got to get a hold of that. So as your superintendent, I want our administrators to know that when you have your teachers' backs, we will have your back at the state level. We also have to think about the mental health of both teachers and students. We know that that has suffered dramatically under COVID, and so I'm very proud of what Governor McMaster and the General Assembly are doing to help better fund mental health in our schools. We have a lot more work that needs to be done on that front, but that's certainly an important piece of recruiting and retaining teachers. The last thing I'll say is that just like this Superintendent of Education job, everything rises and falls on leadership. A great principal in the school building is the person who builds that culture that teachers either want to work in or leave. And so as State Superintendent of Education, I'm going to put a significant focus on high quality, research-driven professional development for our principals so that they can be the great leaders our teachers deserve.
So you have a response?
Yes, the two reasons that teachers leave are salary and working conditions. We've already talked about salary. But working conditions we really have to look at, and honestly that starts at the district level. And so, you know, there are things that as Superintendent of Education I can do and to relieve some of those hoops that teachers have to jump through by looking at, you know, what is in the best interest of students. There are lots of antiquated policies that we're still following. There are lots of policies that, again, may look good on paper, but do not make sense in the classroom that we have to research. I think looking at how we certify our teachers and the expectations that we expect of them. I think, you know, looking at all of those things, those working conditions. But honestly, when you talk about things like student discipline and that comes from how we measure school success through the school report card, which was created by the Education Oversight Committee. So part of all of the hoops that we have to jump through are because we have a lot of bureaucratic overhead. You know, the teachers and school districts have to answer to 3 different people. They have to answer to the Education Oversight Committee. They have to answer to the State Board of Education. They have to answer to the superintendent. And so we've got to really look at streamlining that. And lastly, we've got to ask teachers. We've got to bring that teacher voice up to the policy level and get their input in it, because teaching is different than it was when I first started 22 years ago.
Sean has the next question to you, Lisa.
National assessments, known as the nation's report card, which I'm sure you know very much about, show that we haven't backslid in South Carolina like other states have. However, that doesn't mean we're doing well. State scores show that less than half of our 3rd through 8th graders can read on grade level. Nearly 70% can't do grade level math in 8th grade. What do we need to do to make the kind of giant leaps in performance that we need to do?
I think that, you know, when we're looking at assessments, I think that NAEP, the national assessment, is the one we have to look at because that's comparing apples to apples. I think when we look at other assessments, you can't make the leap that we're failing. Having said that, if you really want to move students, particularly starting at the 3rd grade, you've got to make sure that you have high quality teachers in the classroom and that you've got small class sizes in the K through 3. If you think that a 1st grade teacher can teach 30 1st graders who are 6, 7 years old how to read, you're out of your mind. You've got to get those class sizes down and allow that teacher to focus on all of the teaching tools that she or he has in their toolbox to help those students read. And that's going to look different depending on the student, which is why that smaller class size is so important. You know, when we think about teaching kids, they learn to read from K through 2nd grade, and then 3rd grade they read to learn. So if we can get them reading in those early grades, then we automatically lift them up through the rest of their K through 12 career. But nothing else is going to work until you get high quality teachers in there and you let them do their job and you decrease those class sizes.
Ms. Weaver.
Well, let me go back and just address something about the Education Oversight Committee that I'm actually very proud of in terms of getting the teacher voice into the classroom. We are into the policy discussion in Columbia. At the EOC, we have been advocating and recommending for over 5 years now that we do a statewide anonymous survey with teachers to understand the school climate that is happening in our local schools. And I'm proud to say that the General Assembly adopted that recommendation this year in the state budget. And so that is something that will be happening here in South Carolina going forward. And again, it's a critical way that we're going to engage the teacher voice in policy discussions in South Carolina. Now to the question of NAEP. Thankfully, we did not see the same kind of dramatic drops in our test scores like we did nationwide, but we know nationwide we saw the largest decline in math. I think one of the reasons why we did fare better here in South Carolina is that Governor McMaster and the General Assembly pushed to reopen our schools sooner. And that was something that my opponent sadly opposed. At the behest of the national union, librarians. Science was politicized. The CDC recommended keeping schools closed far longer than they needed to be. And so I'm very glad that here in South Carolina, we did reopen schools sooner. How do we address the problems that we have in South Carolina that existed even before COVID? It really starts with getting back to the basics. Early literacy is absolutely critical and will be my #1 academic priority as state superintendent. We have got to get back to teaching the proven science of reading. And we also know that in-class high-dose tutoring is also very helpful. And so we need an army of mentors and tutors in our schools to support our teachers.
Thank you, Ms. Weaver. Ms. Ellis, did you have a rebuttal to that?
I do, yes. So many things to rebut. I think first and foremost, you don't need to create a task force to find out why teachers are leaving. We've been telling you, I know, for at least 4 years and for longer than that. All you got to do is actually listen to them. As far as, students not falling as far behind, that was because of our teachers and our schools. Hands down, our teachers rocked it in adverse circumstances and doing the best that they could for the students in really, really terrible predicaments. Just worried for their student safety and health, worried for their own safety and health. And so I don't discount the fact that we actually followed the science to do what was best for our students in our schools. And that is something that I will stand behind. And while we were doing that, schools were never closed. It looked different, whether it was virtual or whether it was, in person and face-to-face. But those are issues that really helped our students be successful.
Thank you, Ms. Ellis. Ms. Weaver, this next question is for you. Federal COVID spending packages in 2020 and 2021 allocated an additional $3 billion to South Carolina school districts for a variety of allowed uses. As of September, only about 15% of that influx has been spent. How it's spent is up to local school boards, but how do you think it should be spent, and what can the education agency do to promote those recommendations? And from what you've seen so far, do you think that money is being spent wisely?
Well, accountability for that incredible influx of money is absolutely essential. And the #1 thing that we can do with that money is support our students in their recovery of lost learning. We know that this requires in-school high-dose tutoring, which has been proven to work in other states. We need an army of tutors and mentors here, as I mentioned, here in our classrooms in South Carolina, to give that small group and one-on-one instruction that supports our teachers in their instruction and is going to help our students recover the learning that they have lost. Unfortunately, I don't believe the money is being spent with the level of urgency that it needs to be spent, and I think that that's where the state superintendent of education can actually play a large role in publicizing and promoting best practices that we see working both here in South Carolina and across the country. And perhaps there's even an opportunity to offer some of the funds that were allocated to the State Department of Education as matching grants for districts to engage in some of those best practices that we know are going to move the academic needle for students in the classroom. So again, I'd like to see the money spent with purpose and with urgency.
Ms. Ellis, about the COVID spending?
I think that one of the issues that came with the money was a lack of complete understanding for districts on what they could spend it on. And that took time. Districts had to get approval from the Department of Ed. That took time. And so I think that, in terms of how it's spent, there's a lot of hoops to have to jump through to get all of that approved. When we talk about the effects of COVID, I think it's important for us to realize that the entire world dealt with COVID. So when we talk about learning loss, we have to look at it from a new perspective of these kids. These are our COVID kids. And so they're always going to be dealing with this. But that happened across the nation, across the world. So I'm always more focused on a student's social, emotional, mental health well-being. The academics, they'll learn. I think that we need to be focusing on, making sure that our students are being provided with those services. I also think that this one-time money is a great opportunity for school buildings to be upgraded. When we look at some of our schools across the state, they're 50, 70, 100 years old with old antiquated HVAC systems that are causing, more and more issues, health issues, and those sort of things. So one-time money should be used to build our robust physical buildings so our students feel safe when they go to school.
Ms. Ellis, this next question's to you. In the last few years, 11 tiny school districts have merged in to become 5, but many counties still have multiple school districts, some with fewer than 1,500 students. Will you continue to push for more school district consolidation, and if so, how?
I think that we have to look at, again, using our money wisely and appropriately. To me, it makes sense to consolidate district level services. So for example, if you have multiple districts in a county, you consolidate those districts more so than those schools. So that way you're not spending money on 7 HR departments or 7 superintendents. That's the way that I see us being really fiscally responsible with our money. So much about school is that community. And so I'm always very hesitant to consolidate schools because so much of that comes with that local community and knowing those local needs. But I do think that we need to look at consolidation. I find it very interesting that we have really only focused on rural consolidation and not some of our more urban areas where you've got 4, 5, 7 school districts that we could really be moving that money down into the classroom by consolidating those district services.
Ms. Weaver, to you on school district consolidation.
To me, the number one issue in any policy discussion is doing what is best for students. And so that's certainly true in this issue of school district consolidation. But I do want to go back and address what my opponent said about the COVID kids and make it clear that the United States was an outlier in how long we kept our classrooms closed. Schools in Europe were reopening much faster than schools in America, and they were doing so safely. The reason schools in America stayed closed as long as they did was because of national unions pushing politicized science on the CDC. These are the same national unions who are contributors to my opponent's campaign and whose agenda she will be driving if she is the next superintendent of education. In terms of school district consolidation, I am very proud of the work that Superintendent Spearman and the General Assembly have done to incentivize and make it possible for small rural school districts to consolidate. I truly believe that consolidation is mostly a local decision. If you are doing well in your district in terms of student performance, again, the number one question is how are the students doing? If your students are doing well, I am fine with how you choose to govern yourself at the local level. But if there is academic malfeasance, financial malfeasance, then I think we really need to have a look at what the consolidation plan needs to be. But I'm very encouraged to see the consolidations that are happening in our rural schools, especially small and shrinking populations, and we'll hope to see that continue.
Ms. Ellis, do you want to have a rebuttal?
Yeah, we keep throwing out national unions, and I don't, this is not a union state. My donations have come from teachers, have come from people who support public education, and we did what was, really what was based on the best of our students here. And so you can throw all kind of, national politics around, but politics really has no business in educating our kids. When we throw politics and rhetoric and false narratives into the mix, our students are the ones who lose out.
And Shauna has the next question to Ellen Weaver.
Superintendent Spearman has taken over 3 school districts in her tenure and put at least another one on watch. Do you think failing school districts should be taken over? Are you willing to take on that responsibility? Is there something else we should be doing?
Well, state law clearly prescribes the conditions under which school takeovers or district takeovers are necessary. And I certainly think, again, this comes back to doing what is in the best interest of students. In many of these districts that Superintendent Spearman has had to go into, we know that the large proportion of their education funding actually comes from the state because they have a low index of tax-paying ability. And so I believe with that additional state input and resources comes responsibility for what happens in those school districts, especially when it comes to the academic outcomes of children. And so I think Superintendent Spearman has been very judicious in her use of the takeover power. I think that it should always be the option of last resort. And I think that when it does happen, we need to ensure that we have a high caliber plan in place to turn around these districts for the long term and not just drop in for a few years and then turn it back over to leadership that was failing the students in the first place.
I think that, it's important for us to understand why school districts are being taken over, and the superintendent should look very carefully at the reasons. If we're looking at it from, a academic standpoint, I want to be sure that the measurements that we're using to determine the academic standing of those students is a valid measurement. I don't think that you can say that when you look at how we assess our students in South Carolina. I think that if we're looking at it from a financial aspect, absolutely. School districts need to be held accountable and be transparent. Anyone who receives public money should be held to accountability and transparency standards. So I think that that is very important. And I think that there needs to be a plan going in place, but I think it needs to be involving those families, those students, those teachers that are involved in those school districts, instead of the superintendent or the superintendent's team coming in and saying, this is what we're going to do. In order to fix problems, you've got to understand what the problems are. And the people that understand what the problems are the ones in those school districts and understand that community, understand what those students are dealing with. So I think that in the case of that being taken over, you've got to be willing to have those conversations at that local level to understand truly what is going on.
Shauna.
So evaluations earlier this year determined that it would cost more than $1.5 billion just to meet our most critical needs, construction needs in our poorest districts. The legislature in the last couple of years has been sort of chipping away at that. What do you think the state's responsibility is in terms of school construction, and are you willing to push the legislature to continue a yearly investment?
I would always push the legislature to do what is in the best interest of students. I mentioned earlier that we have school buildings that are 50, 70, 100 years old. There was a school in Lee County where the ceiling caved in. And, those are things that when you talk about academic learning for students, if they don't have a safe building in which to learn, that is free from mold and mildew and those sort of things, then you can't expect them to focus on learning. I think that as a state, and it is written into our Constitution, we have an obligation to educate our students, and that starts off with safe school buildings. When we talk about school safety, a safe school building, safe and secure school building, is one of the ways to make sure that that happens. For too long, our state has neglected our school buildings around the state, and now they're paying the price because what would have cost much less years ago is now costing more and more. I do think that we have a responsibility, the legislature has a responsibility to fund education, and they haven't done that since 2008, and we see the price that our students are paying because of it.
Ms. Weaver.
I do believe that it is a responsibility of the state to ensure that our students have safe and secure learning environments wherever they are in this state. There is so much money that is currently in our education system, and I'd like to see us make efficient use of the money that we already have in the system before we just start throwing money at problems. It seems like that too often is the call and the default of many in the education status quo, such as my opponent, who always go to more money is the answer. I think that there are many things that we can do at the state level through the Office of School Facilities to look at our buildings across the state, to develop a priority list, and then to go to the General Assembly to get that list funded. But again, that's going to actually take someone who is willing to work with the General Assembly, who has the relationships to get things done, not someone who has been adversarial and really done nothing but burn bridges over the last 4 years.
I don't know if exactly that qualifies for a rebuttal, but I'm assuming maybe.
I would like to,
Yes.
to make a rebuttal. I find it so ironic that I am considered the status quo when I am the low man on the totem pole and have been fighting to have my voice heard for 4 years about the problems in education. The status quo is not me. The status quo, the teachers who we are the ones who are fighting hard for our students. When we're talking about funding, I think it's important for us to understand that our General Assembly has underfunded our schools since 2008 to the tune of $700 per student last year. So when you're consistently underfunding, you cannot expect students and teachers to have success. That is the role of the superintendent, is to push for proper funding for our schools. Can we change some of the funding? Absolutely. But first of all, we need to make sure that we're fully funding it.
Thank you. Ms. Weaver, this question is to you. On the Republican primary ballot in June, there was a non-binding advisory question that asked if school board elections should be partisan. There have been efforts like this at the local level as well. Do you think that school boards should be partisan?
I think that there should be truth in advertising when people go to vote. And so, it's up to the General Assembly and ultimately the voters of the state to determine if that happens. But if it does, I will support it. But I'd like to go back and talk a little bit about funding of education in South Carolina. So this is the underfunding myth is something that we hear often from people who, again, their first answer is always, we just need to spend more money. That underfunding myth doesn't account for all of the rest of the education funding that we spend on K-12 education. Most voters don't know that we spend over $11 billion a year in South Carolina. That comes out to about $15,500 per student. That's also almost half of our total state budget. So we are spending a lot of money on education in South Carolina. The question is, how are we spending it? In my role at Palmetto Promise Institute, I have been privileged to work with the General Assembly over the last 5 or 6 years to make our funding stream much more accountable, to consolidate programs and line items into a true student-centered cost that is based on the needs of each individual student, whether they have a special need, whether they're gifted and talented, maybe whether they're in a rural area, whether they go to a charter school. It's critically important that we have transparency for our funding, and the way that we do that is tying dollars directly to students to make sure that they get back down into classrooms. But we are not underfunding education in South Carolina.
Thank you, Ms. Weaver. Ms. Ellis, a question to you about partisan school boards.
Right. Could you repeat what the actual question was?
Sorry, yeah, there was a primary ballot question there on the June primary ballot for the Republican Party, just about if the school boards should be partisan.
I firmly do not believe that they should. Again, as I said earlier, politics has no place in education. When you start making it more about party than about what is in the best interest of students, students lose. And that's what we have done. That's what this race has done. That's what my opponent has done, has made it all about rhetoric and politics instead of focusing on what the actual problems are in our public school system and working to fix those. So no, that needs to be, this actual office should be nonpartisan. And that's something that I believe very strongly in, because we need to do what is best for our students, and that has nothing to do with politics.
Ms. Weaver, rebuttal.
I completely agree that the interest of our students and our parents and our teachers are first and foremost what we need to be looking at in this race. But I think that there also has to be a real reckoning and accountability for our records. My opponent likes to run away from the fact that her SC for Ed group is part of a much larger Red for Ed movement that is funded by Randy Weingarten and the American Federation for Teachers, that was started to push partisan progressive politics in red states. That is a fact, and that is something that people within the movement will acknowledge at the national level. She also has received a $3,500 contribution from the National Education Association, which is one of the most radically left organizations in education. They believe in pronoun politics. They believe parents are domestic terrorists, much like Merrick Garland. And unfortunately, they also don't believe that English should be the primary language of the United States. And so these are people who are out of touch with the mainstream of South Carolina values. And these are the people who my opponent calls friends. So while she can pretend that politics isn't part of this race, she's the one who's brought it into it.
Ms. Ellis, this next question is to you. What should the state superintendent's role be in what is said, in what is and isn't in a school's library? What, if any, books do you believe should be banned in South Carolina schools? And would you support parental waivers that give children access to books that some would consider banning?
I think that that is, again, one of those issues that has become an issue that has never really been an issue. When we talk about book banning, I think it's very interesting to understand and to sit there and judge on who gets to decide what book is appropriate. When you talk about the actual issues going on in South Carolina, I would like to know what specific books students have been forced to read, because as a teacher who taught English for many, many years, our students always had choice in what they wanted to read. That's how teaching has evolved this year, because students and teachers know that students learn best when they see themselves reflected in the classroom. And so for me to go so far as to ban books, you're taking away my rights as a citizen, because if we're talking about banning books in libraries, not everybody has to check out that book. That's the beauty of choice. But to sit there and infringe on my rights because of your beliefs is really unacceptable and is not allowing our students a whole education. You know, when we talk about how we want to educate our students, we want to prepare them for the world that will exist. And that world is a beautiful, diverse world. And we need to make sure that we're giving them all of the perspectives so they can make their own decisions about what they believe and follow that through in a safe space, which is where schools are. You know, those schools, they have the educators there to protect them from that.
Thank you, Ms. Ellison. Ms. Weaver, your response to that question?
It's clear that we have found wildly inappropriate materials in our school libraries, things that I couldn't read on camera here tonight over these airwaves. There is no reason why we should be spending taxpayer dollars to purchase pornography to be in our children's school libraries. So I reject the premise of the question because I don't believe that it's book banning. You know, a parent, if they want their child to read these materials, can still go out and buy them on Amazon. We're not talking about To Kill a Mockingbird or Catcher in the Rye or some of those classics that we know are the literary masterpieces that our students need to be exposed to. We're talking about crassly inappropriate pornographic materials that have been found, sadly, in school libraries in South Carolina. And so what can be done about it? Well, at the state level, I believe that the Superintendent of Education needs to issue clear guidance, as Superintendent Spearman has, to our local school districts. Those school boards need to adopt policies that are clear and transparent and that give parents a process to be able to contest materials that they don't believe is appropriate for their children. These are things that parents have the right to decide, and a school should never come between a parent and a child in these critical decisions.
Shauna, you have the next question.
Let's talk about vouchers. Ms. Weaver, the organization that you lead has been pushing legislation for vouchers or tax credits since its founding. It's obviously been a debate in the legislature for almost 20 years. What would you do as superintendent to further that effort, knowing that you can't do anything unilaterally?
Well, to be clear, as Superintendent of Education, my primary role will be ensuring that our public schools are the most excellent that they can possibly be. However, we also know that in states that have choice programs, look at Florida, which has some of the oldest and largest choice programs in the country, their students in traditional public schools are doing better. And that's because the power of competition is the power that lifts all boats, the tide that lifts all boats. I'm so proud to stand with people like Senator Tim Scott, who has been a champion for choice in whatever environment a student learns, be that a great traditional public school, a public charter school, a magnet school, homeschool, a private school. I want children to be in the environment where they can learn best. And too often, many families face income limitations because of their zip code and just because of their family circumstances. I want every child to be able to get into the education environment that is right for them. As state superintendent, the Education Scholarship Bill was written to be administered by the Department of Education, and if that bill were to come to my Department of Education, I would certainly implement it with fidelity and in a way that would be usable for parents and for students. I think that choice is truly, as Condi Rice says, the great civil rights issue of our time, and I'm an unapologetic defender of the rights of parents to make the best education decision for their child, whatever their income level or zip code.
To you more specifically, I don't think there's any question that you oppose vouchers. Is there any school choice that you back? And what would you do as superintendent to perhaps work to defeat choice proposals?
Absolutely. The reality is that we already have school choice. We have it in the sense that we have multiple opportunities for students to choose different schools within their district. We have a strong public charter system. And then, of course, there's private schools and homeschools and all that. So people already have school choice. When we talk about vouchers and tax credits, the concern that I continue to have is that there's a lack of transparency and accountability. So when you're talking about moving public dollars into the hands of private citizens or schools, you're talking about losing that accountability and transparency. The reality is that if you are not a public school a public school in South Carolina, you can choose who comes through your doors. And that, when the Superintendent of Education is tasked with educating all students in South Carolina, we need to make sure that we are protecting our public schools and using all the available funds that we have. I also would comment that you can't say that public schools are failing when you have underfunded them, as we have since 2008. And so to me, until you sit there and properly fund our education system and provide those opportunities for our students, then we can talk. But you will never hear me say that public school or public money should go to private entities. I think that we can improve choice in our public school systems with the right funding and the ability to use that funding wisely.
Thank you. Sean.
One of the hot button issues out there is what's broadly referred to as critical race theory. And state law already bans it through budget provisos in terms of the concept, but it's still very hotly debated. How do you define critical race theory, or CRT? Is it a problem in our schools? And or are you concerned that the debate itself will stifle what kids need to learn in history?
Yeah, again, I think this is one of those issues that is not an actual problem. I tell people it's chasing ghosts. We're chasing issues that don't exist in order to, sort of hide the actual issues that we're dealing with. Critical race theory, the actual theory, looks through how our country has developed through, the lens of keeping minorities down. That is not what is in any of the state standards that our teachers teach. K through 12, our teachers, focus on teaching our state standards, which are approved ultimately by the Education Oversight Committee and are open to public forum for comment. So if we're talking about what is in the best interest of our students need to be taught all of history. They need to be taught all of the perspectives. Again, going back to preparing our students for a life that exists out of K through 12, we need to make sure that they have all of the information and all of the truths, regardless of how that comes off. And that way they can then think critically and make sure that they have all of the information. Again, learning in a safe space, which is a teacher's classroom, gives students the opportunity to ask questions, to be curious, and to make those decisions. But we have to be willing to give that comprehensive education.
Ms. Weaver.
Going back real quick just to address the school choice, we do have school choice for families in this state who have the economic means, such as my opponent's parents did, to send her to one of the most exclusive private schools in the state, or you could move into a great neighborhood that has a wonderful public school in it. But unfortunately, that's not the reality of the vast majority of people in this state. And so I feel like it's a little out of touch to say we have school choice when only certain people in our state have school choice. Secondly, about the issue of CRT. CRT really has become a catch-all term for a much larger woke ideology that we have seen in our colleges of higher education for decades, and so we certainly now see it seeping down into K-12 schools. There are multiple examples that I have heard from both parents and teachers in this state about it being in the classroom and about it being in the professional development that is being forced on our teachers. And so when I talk about standing up against woke ideology in our public schools and using our schools for education, not indoctrination, I'm bent on on standing up for our teachers, not just for our students, because I think the vast majority of teachers in this state want to truly educate their children in the way their children need to be educated. I do think that there is a very pernicious ideology that's out there in works like Kimberly Crenshaw and Ibram X. Kendi, who claim that the only way that we can fight racism is by being racist. I just think that's fundamentally wrong. I think any ideology that determines a child's value or whether they are an oppressor or a victim by the color of their skin, as Senator Tim Scott has said, is just simply wrong. We've got to bring people together, not pull them further apart.
Lisa, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, again, I have had the opportunity of traveling the state and talking to teachers and students for that matter. And whenever this question is brought up, I say, I would like to know the specific examples, and nobody can give them to me. Again, it is, that rhetoric that is coming out without people actually knowing and being able to give specific examples of what that looks like. I think that we have to understand that history, when you look at it whole hog from all perspectives, There are ugly parts to it, but we have to understand those parts of it to be able to understand why we are in the situations that we're in these current times. If you don't teach students all of the perspectives, then you're not giving them a fair shot in how to navigate, again, the world that that exists for them. And we have to do right by our students by teaching them all of it.
Thank you, Ms. Ellis. Ms. Weaver, this question's to you. Currently, there is one mental health counselor per every 1,300 students in South Carolina, according to DHHS. Efforts are underway to improve this now that the problem has been clearly identified at the behest of the governor. But how will you be proactive and innovative in how children receive the mental health counseling that they need?
Well, I was so glad that the governor requested that audit and highlighted the program because it really is an urgent situation here in South Carolina. The recommendations that the governor and the director of DHHS have come out with are really great. We have got to make parity for payment. We realized that different providers were being paid in different ways, and so we've got to create parity to get the most possible personnel into our schools to help support our students and our teachers in their mental health needs. There's no question about it. I think another important aspect of this is that we need to provide resources and supports for parents to be fully engaged in supporting their children's mental health. This is something that schools can't do alone. For far too long, we've asked our teachers and our administrators to try to be everything to everybody. We need the entire community engaged in this conversation. And so as State Superintendent of Education, I'm going to be looking to put my bridge building experience to work to engage our faith community, our business community, and our parents in our schools to help support our students and meet them where they are in their mental health needs as well as their academic needs.
Ms. Ellis.
Mental health is something, an issue that teachers have been screaming into the void for years, well before COVID. What COVID showed us is that, hey, if we had listened to teachers all along, we could have been addressing these issues ahead of time. Mental health, that ratio is really sad, but it's what I see in our schools every day. I worked in a middle school where there was a mental health counselor on Tuesdays from 9 to 12 and then Thursdays from 12 to 3. And so, we as adults were like, well, I guess we can't have any issues on Wednesday. That's unacceptable for our students. I think that we have to address that. And sadly, again, it comes through funding. When you're underfunding, you're expecting your local districts to make up that difference. And those are the type of places that are roles that get swept under the rug because there's not enough to pay for them. I think we also need to recognize the professional capacity of mental health counselors and school psychologists and social workers and pay them what they're worth. And I think we also have to look at what we're expecting of students in a school setting. When we're dealing with high stakes testing and so much testing, that leads to testing anxiety, which leads to general anxiety, and it doesn't make for a positive experience. But right now, we've got students that are hurting for a number of different reasons, and those are society's problems that schools are having to address. And so you've got to give schools the resources and the funding to be able to do that.
Thank you, Ms. Ellis. And this next question is for you, talking about school safety. It's been a priority of the governor, and Superintendent of Education Molly Spearman says that based on conversations that she's had with SLED Chief Mark Keel, local districts and law enforcement officials, that a response to a school shooting like Uvalde would not happen in South Carolina. Do you feel that schools are safe, and do we need to do more than just put an officer in every school?
Absolutely. When you talk about school safety, there is not one thing that is going to be where you say, oh, this is what's going to solve that problem. School safety it's a spider web where you've got to look at addressing your class sizes, right? You've got to have smaller class sizes so teachers have the opportunity to build relationships. You've got to address, the anxiety and the mental health pieces of it. You've got to address the school building itself. Is the school safe? Are there locks on doors? Are there ways for people to get into the school buildings? But then also, honestly, you've got to address gun responsibility, and you've got to address making sure that gun owners are, following that, protecting people from access to guns. So it's all of us. Again, that's a society problem that's coming into schools. I think that School resource officers can be helpful if they are there in the capacity of building relationships. That's the key when you look at what is going around and why kids become, do what they do. It's because of a reaction to their own learning environment. When we look at school shooters, they weren't successful academically. So we've got to make sure that our students are successful academically. All of that is going to work to creating safer schools, but it's not this is going to solve the problem and that's it.
Ms. Weaver, school safety.
Well, to be clear, taking guns away from law-abiding citizens will not make our schools safer. And so I, unlike my opponent, reject calls for new gun restrictions on law-abiding citizens. That makes absolutely no sense. In terms of how we keep our schools safe, the recent swatting incidents, I was speaking to parents and teachers who were in a school where one of them happened, and the panic that they described to me of, first of all, being in the school and in that lockdown situation, and then secondly, of a parent being away from their child. I mean, it's visceral. It really is visceral. And I'd like to commend my opponent for the work that she does, because I know her school was one of those schools that experienced one of those incidents. And I know that's a very, very difficult thing to have to live through. But how do we solve this at the state level? Well, I think we do have to make sure that we have an SRO in every school. We've made great progress in that direction over the last few years with the General Assembly fully funding them. Now we just have to find the people. We have changed the restrictions in terms of allowing retired law enforcement officers to serve as SROs now without impacting their pensions. That's another great common sense step forward. I'd love to see if there's a way for us to engage our retired veterans. They've answered the call to service once. I think they would answer it again to help keep our students and our teachers safe. But ultimately, this again comes back to leadership. How are we going to work together with other state agencies and law enforcement in order to make sure that our schools are safe? And that takes relationship building and leadership.
Thank you, Ms. Weaver. Did you want a rebuttal there, Lisa? Okay.
I think that it is very typical of taking what I said out of context. When I talk about gun responsibility, I'm not talking about taking guns away. I think that there are definitely, we can decrease the access to assault rifles. I think that we can be, much more considerate in who has access to guns and how they get access. Having said that, yeah, my school was one of the ones that was swatted, and that is a feeling like no other. That is a feeling that my opponent will never know because she has never been in schools and been at that level. So it's hard for me to sit there and listen to the untruths that are spoken, but also to assume that you know what that is like. Having been in that experience, I feel that we really need to look at all of those issues.
And Shauna has the next question to Ms. Weaver.
Going back to teacher shortages for a minute, there was legislation passed by both chambers but didn't make it to the governor's desk that would allow districts to fill some vacancies with professionals with expertise that don't have a teaching license. What role, if any, should non-certified professionals play in filling teacher shortages?
Well, I think we need to cast a wide net for qualified people to be in our classroom. And I know there are great examples of things that are happening in states like Tennessee, where they're creating a teacher apprenticeship program, repurposing other federal funds that are coming down into the state in order to get someone who has subject matter expertise into a classroom to mentor under a teacher and to work towards their teaching certification license. So I think that there are many things that we can do to expand the pool of talent that is available to teach in our classrooms. I'd love to think about how we could harness retired teachers to come in and serve as mentors and tutors. And of course, we need to look at our teacher preparation programs. I have never once talked to a teacher in this state who said it was that third-year pedagogy class that really made me a great teacher. They always talk about another teacher who mentored them, about a principal who coached them. And so I would love to see our teacher certification and preparation programs become much more focused on in-classroom experience. I think that's how we are going to retain teachers, especially those new teachers that we are losing in the first 5 years of teaching. And so as State Superintendent of Education, I look forward to working with our colleges and our institutions of higher education to talk about how we can create a more useful, practical method to get more people and more teachers into our classrooms.
Ms. Ellis.
I think it's important for us to understand that South Carolina does not have a shortage of teachers. We have plenty of teachers who have left the classroom because of salary and working conditions. So I think that if we rework, increase the salary, and revisit working conditions, then we will have teachers that come back to the classroom. In terms of uncertified, I think it is a fallacy for people to believe that anybody can teach. Teaching is both an art and a science. The science aspect of it is knowing your content, making sure that you know what you're talking about. And then the art is in the delivery. How do you deliver it to students? And that's different based on the age that you teach. That's different based on whether it's first period or third period, because the students that we encounter every day have different sets of needs. And so, you know, to sit there and assume that somebody who is a welder out in their job can come in and teach welding, I don't think is a fair assessment. For example, my own school, we had somebody from industry come to teach graphics, and that teacher lasted 4 days. And so I think that we need to really think about who we're placing and really work to get our certified teachers back into the classroom. And again, we do that through lowering class sizes, increasing salaries, and then working on those working conditions.
I'm going to take this last question because we have limited time left, and it's going to be a minute response. And this question is to you, Lisa. Other than what we've already talked about, what initiatives of your predecessor would you continue, and what would you end?
I would really, in terms of what I would end, I really want us to look at our teacher evaluation system. I think that it is very punitive in how we evaluate our teachers, and I would want to look at that again, bringing that teacher voice, that administrator voice to the table to develop a much more effective system that looks at more of a coaching format. I think that Superintendent Spearman has done a really great job getting public education back to where it needs to be. I think she did a great job getting our bus fleet taken care of. And then, you know, she had a really hard job working through COVID. And so I think that, you know, with what she had at hand, she did a good job. But I think that it's time for us to really start thinking outside of the box and really looking at what are the best ways that we can serve our students. And we've got to move away from the 19th and 20th century model of teaching and into the 21st century.
Thank you. Ms. Weaver.
Well, I'm honored to have Superintendent Spearman's endorsement. She understands that I have the leadership skills that it takes to actually run a multi-billion-dollar agency and manage almost 1,000 staff. So I'm grateful to have her endorsement and her vote of confidence. In terms of the many things that she has done that I would like to see continued, the first is school safety. She has worked very hard to ensure that our school buildings are safe. There's a lot more work to do, but she's been in regular contact with Chief Keel, with law enforcement officers across this state. If our students and teachers aren't safe, nothing else matters. And so that's a critical legacy that I look forward to continuing. She also has recently started to focus very heavily on early literacy. That will be my #1 academic priority as State Superintendent of Education. We have got to get back to teaching phonics in our classroom, and that's the only way that we're ever going to close the achievement gap or the opportunity gap that we see in so many areas of our state. So those are two very concrete things that Superintendent Spearman has done very, very well.
Thank you, Ms. Weaver. And thanks to all of our candidates for joining us tonight, and thanks to Shauna Adcox of the Post and Courier. And join us Tuesday, November 8th on this ETV station beginning at 8 p.m. for election results and analysis from around the state. I'm Gavin Jackson, and from all of us here at ETV, thanks for tuning in. Good night.